The night shift security guard rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:47 a.m. at Lagos General Hospital, one of the busiest medical facilities in Nigeria. The humid air from outside barely moved through the old ventilation system, making the security room feel like a small oven, even at this late hour. Jabulani had been working at the hospital for 15 years. He knew every corner, every sound, every shadow that moved through these corridors. Tonight seemed like any other night. Empty hallways bathed in dim fluorescent light, the occasional nurse checking on patients, and the distant sound of the generator humming in the basement. He reached for his lukewarm tea, a habit his wife Aduni always teased him about. "Who drinks tea in Lagos heat?" she would say. But Jabulani found comfort in the routine. As he brought the cup to his lips, movement on monitor 12 caught his attention. Room 306. The cup froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened as he leaned forward, nearly knocking over his tea in the process. The patient in room 306 was Chidi Okonkwo, a 43-year-old businessman who had been in a coma for 3 months following a terrible accident on 3rd Mainland Bridge. The rain had been particularly heavy that night, and Chidi's car had collided with a Dawnfo bus that had lost control. The doctors at Lagos General had done everything they could, but Chidi remained unresponsive. Dr. Babatunde, the head physician, had gently told Chidi's wife that while her husband was stable, his brain activity was minimal. Recovery seemed unlikely. Yet there on the grainy security monitor, Chidi was slowly pushing himself up from his hospital bed. Jabulani rubbed his eyes again, certain that the long night shift was playing tricks on him. He had seen many things in his years at the hospital: grieving families, miraculous recoveries, and heartbreaking losses. But never had he seen a comatose patient simply sit up as if waking from an afternoon nap. He quickly switched camera angles, accessing the second camera in room 306. The image remained the same. Chidi Okonkwo was now sitting on the edge of his bed, his thin legs dangling over the side. The man who hadn't moved a muscle in 3 months was stretching his arms as if preparing for something important. Jabulani's hand hovered over the emergency button. He should alert the medical staff immediately. This was either a miracle or a medical emergency. But something made him pause. There was something deliberate about Chidi's movements, something purposeful that made Jabulani want to see what would happen next. Chidi stood up slowly, his legs surprisingly steady for someone who had been bedridden for so long. The hospital gown hung loosely on his frame. He had lost considerable weight during his coma. His wife, Amara, had been bringing his favorite egusi soup every day, hoping the familiar smell might wake him, but the food always remained untouched. The security guard watched as Chidi walked to the small window in his room and looked out at the Lagos skyline. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for a moment, Chidi seemed to be taking it all in, as if seeing the world for the first time. Then, with the same deliberate movement, he turned and walked toward his room door. Jabulani's fingers flew across the keyboard, switching between cameras to track Chidi's movement. The corridor camera showed the door to room 306 opening slowly. Chidi stepped out into the hallway, his bare feet silent on the cold tile floor. The 4th floor of Lagos General Hospital was the intensive care unit. At this hour, it was mostly quiet except for the steady beeping of various machines keeping patients alive. Nurse Fatima was at the nurses' station at the far end of the corridor, filling out paperwork with her back to the hallway. She didn't see Chidi as he moved past, walking with increasing confidence toward a specific destination. Room 307. Jabulani knew that room well. It housed the youngest patient on the floor, 3-month-old baby Kesi. The little girl had been born with a severe heart condition and had already undergone 2 surgeries. Her young mother, Dalila, rarely left her side, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair next to the baby's crib every night. But tonight, Dalila had finally been convinced by the nurses to go home for a few hours of proper rest. Her sister had come from Ibadan to stay with the baby, but she too had dozed off in the chair, exhausted from the long journey. Chidi pushed open the door to room 307 with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who should barely be able to walk. He moved past the sleeping aunt without disturbing her and approached the baby's crib. That's when Jabulani noticed something alarming on his monitors. The machines next to baby Kesi's crib showed her vital signs, and they were dropping rapidly. Her heart rate was becoming dangerously irregular, and her oxygen levels were falling. The alarm should have been screaming, alerting every medical professional on the floor, but they remained eerily silent. Later investigation would reveal a power surge had disabled the alarm system in that room without affecting the monitoring equipment. A 1 in a million technical glitch that could have been fatal. Chidi reached into the crib and gently lifted baby Kesi. The infant was turning a concerning shade of blue, her tiny chest barely moving. Without hesitation, Chidi held her against his chest and began patting her back with practiced movements, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Jabulani watched in stunned silence as Chidi performed what looked like infant CPR techniques, alternating between gentle chest compressions and back pats. The security guard's training finally kicked in, and he grabbed the emergency phone, but his eyes never left the monitor. Within moments that felt like hours, baby Kesi let out a loud wail. Color flooded back into her tiny face, and her arms flailed with renewed vigor. The sleeping aunt jolted awake at the sound, her eyes widening in shock at the sight of a strange man in a hospital gown holding the baby. Before she could scream, Chidi gently placed the now-breathing baby back in her crib. He touched the infant's forehead softly, almost like a blessing, then turned and walked out of the room as calmly as he had entered. The aunt, frozen in shock, could only watch as he left. It was only when she looked at the baby, now breathing normally with healthy pink cheeks, that she found her voice and called for the nurses. By the time Nurse Fatima rushed into room 307, Chidi was already making his way back down the corridor. The security cameras captured every moment as he returned to his room, climbed back into his bed, and lay down in the exact position he had been in for 3 months. Within seconds, his eyes closed, and he was once again completely unresponsive. Jabulani finally hit the emergency button, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. Within minutes, the 4th floor was in chaos. Dr. Babatunde arrived despite the late hour, having been called from his home in Victoria Island. Nurse Fatima was checking on baby Kesi, who was now stable and showing no signs of distress. The aunt was trying to explain what she had seen, her Yoruba mixing with English as she struggled to make sense of it all. "I swear on my mother's grave," she kept saying, "the man in the hospital gown saved her. He knew exactly what to do." Dr. Babatunde ordered a full examination of Chidi Okonkwo. Every test came back the same. He was still in a deep coma, showing minimal brain activity. There was no medical explanation for what had happened. His muscles showed no sign of recent use, his brain scans were unchanged, and yet the security footage was undeniable. Jabulani was asked to review the footage again and again. Each time, the truth remained the same. For exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds, Chidi Okonkwo had been awake, alert, and had saved a baby's life. Word of the incident spread through the hospital like Harmattan wind. By morning, everyone from the cleaners to the chief administrator had heard about the miracle on the 4th floor. Some said it was juju. Others called it a divine intervention. The hospital's Christian fellowship group gathered to pray, while the Muslim staff offered their own prayers of thanksgiving. Dalila arrived at the hospital that morning to find her baby surrounded by doctors, all confirming that Kesi was in better condition than she had been in weeks. When they showed her the security footage, she fell to her knees and wept. "Allah has sent an angel," she whispered through her tears. The news eventually reached Amara Okonkwo. She had just arrived for her daily visit, carrying a thermos of pepper soup that her mother-in-law had insisted would help. When Dr. Babatunde showed her the footage, she couldn't speak for several minutes. "That's my Chidi," she finally said, tears streaming down her face. "Even in his sleep, he's trying to help people. That's who he is." She spent the rest of the day by his bedside, holding his hand and talking to him about what had happened. She told him about baby Kesi, about how the whole hospital was calling him a hero. She begged him to come back to her, to their children who missed their father terribly. But Chidi remained still, showing no sign of the miraculous awakening from the night before. The hospital administration was faced with a dilemma. The footage was clear, but the medical explanation was non-existent. They brought in specialists from Lagos University Teaching Hospital, even consulting with experts from South Africa and Egypt. Everyone agreed what had happened was medically impossible. Dr. Aisha, the hospital's leading neurologist, spent hours reviewing Chidi's brain scans. She had trained at Johns Hopkins in America and prided herself on her scientific approach to medicine. But even she had to admit that science had no answer for this. "The human brain is still largely a mystery," she told the assembled medical team. "Perhaps there are states of consciousness we don't yet understand." 3 days after the incident, Inspector Jabulani from the Lagos State Police was brought in to verify the authenticity of the security footage. The hospital needed official documentation that the footage hadn't been tampered with, especially as news of the miracle had begun to spread beyond the hospital walls. The inspector, a methodical man who had investigated everything from fraud to murder in his 20-year career, spent hours analyzing the footage. He checked timestamps, looked for signs of editing, even brought in a technical expert from the cybercrime unit. "The footage is genuine," he finally declared. "Whatever happened here, it really happened." As news spread, people began gathering outside the hospital. Some came hoping for their own miracles. Others simply wanted to be near the place where something inexplicable had occurred. The hospital had to hire extra security to manage the crowds. Religious leaders from various faiths came to offer their interpretations. Pastor Augustine from the nearby Pentecostal church declared it a sign of God's power. Imam Abdullah from the central mosque spoke of divine mercy. Even the traditional healers from the market had their theories about spiritual awakening and ancestral intervention. But perhaps the most moving response came from an unexpected source. A week after the incident, an elderly man named Baba Seku, who had worked as a cleaner at the hospital for 30 years, approached Amara with a story. "Madam," he said in his quiet voice, "I want to tell you something about your husband." Baba Seku explained that 3 months ago, just days before his accident, Chidi had found him crying in the hospital parking lot. Baba Seku's granddaughter had been diagnosed with leukemia, and he couldn't afford the treatment. "Your husband didn't know me," Baba Seku said, "but he sat with me for an hour, listening to my troubles. The next day, he came back and gave me an envelope. Inside was enough money for my granddaughter's treatment. He made me promise not to tell anyone." Amara wasn't surprised. That was exactly the kind of thing Chidi would do. "He told me," Baba Seku continued, "that we are all connected, that helping one person creates ripples that touch many lives. Maybe this is one of those ripples." 2 weeks passed, and life at the hospital began to return to normal, though everyone still spoke in hushed tones when passing room 306. Baby Kesi continued to improve, gaining weight and strength every day. Her mother, Dalila, had placed a small photo of Chidi next to her daughter's crib, calling him their guardian angel. Then, on a humid Thursday afternoon, something extraordinary happened again. Amara was reading to Chidi from his favorite book, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, when she felt his hand twitch in hers. She had felt such movements before, involuntary muscle spasms, the doctors had explained, but this felt different. This felt intentional. "Chidi," she whispered, afraid to hope. His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully slowly, they opened. For the first time in 3 months, Chidi Okonkwo looked at his wife with conscious eyes. "Amara," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. The joy that erupted from room 306 could be heard throughout the 4th floor. Nurses came running, "Doctor." Babatunde was paged immediately, and within minutes, the room was full of medical staff, all witnessing what they had begun to think might never happen. Chidi was weak but alert. He could move all his limbs, though with difficulty. His cognitive function seemed intact. It was, by all medical standards, a miracle recovery. But the real shock came when Dr. Babatunde asked him if he remembered anything from his coma. Chidi was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I remember fragments," he said carefully. "Like dreams, but more real. I remember feeling that someone needed help. A child. I had to help the child." "Do you remember getting up?" "Walking?" Dr. Babatunde asked, trying to keep his voice clinical despite his excitement. Chidi shook his head. "Not walking. It was more like floating. Like my spirit left my body. I know how that sounds, but that's what it felt like." He turned to look at his wife. "I could hear you, Amara. Every day. Your voice kept me tethered to this world. But that night I heard another voice. A baby crying, but not with her mouth, with her soul. She was calling for help, and somehow I could answer." The medical team exchanged glances. There was no scientific framework for what Chidi was describing, Yet the evidence was undeniable. As news of Chidi's awakening spread, the hospital once again became a site of pilgrimage. People wanted to see the man who had risen from his coma to save a child, then return to that coma until he was ready to truly wake up. But Chidi was uncomfortable with the attention. As soon as he was strong enough, he asked to meet baby Kesi and her mother properly. The meeting was arranged in the hospital's small chapel, away from prying eyes. Dalila brought her daughter, now healthy and alert. When she placed the baby in Chidi's arms, Kesi seemed to recognize him, reaching out her tiny hand to touch his face. "She knows you," Dalila said through tears. "She knows you saved her." Chidi looked down at the baby, and for a moment, everyone in the room felt something shift in the air, something sacred and unexplainable. "We saved each other," Chidi said softly. As he recovered, Chidi struggled to explain his experience. He spoke of being in a place between worlds, aware of his body in the hospital bed, but also conscious of a different realm where thoughts and intentions had physical power. "I could feel the suffering around me," he told Dr. Aisha during one of their sessions. "Not just physical pain, but emotional pain, spiritual pain. And somehow I knew I had to act. When I sensed the baby in distress, it was like a bell ringing in my soul. I had to answer." Dr. Aisha, despite her scientific training, found herself believing him. She had begun researching similar cases around the world and had found scattered reports of comatose patients showing awareness or even movement that couldn't be explained by current medical understanding. "Perhaps," she said to her colleagues, "consciousness is not as binary as we think. Perhaps there are states between waking and sleeping, between life and death, that we're only beginning to understand." The Catholic priest who served as the hospital chaplain, Father Michael, had his own interpretation. He spoke of saints who bilocated, appearing in two places at once to help those in need. He suggested that Chidi had experienced something similar, his soul moving independently of his body to perform an act of mercy. The traditional healers who gathered at Oshodi Market had different theories. They spoke of the thin veil between the physical and spiritual worlds, and how sometimes, in moments of a great need, that veil could be crossed. They said Chidi had the gift of spiritual sight, and his accident had awakened it. But Chidi himself was less interested in explanations than in action. Once he recovered enough to leave the hospital, he established a foundation to help families with children in the ICU. He used his business connections to raise funds for medical equipment and to support families who couldn't afford treatment. "I was given a second chance," he said at the foundation's launch, "not just to live, but to understand why we live. We're here to help each other, to be the miracle someone else is praying for." Baby Kesi became the foundation's first beneficiary, with all her medical expenses covered. As she grew stronger, her mother Dalila became a volunteer at the foundation, helping other mothers navigate the terrifying world of pediatric intensive care. The security footage of that night became legendary, not just in Lagos, but around the world. Medical journals published papers about it. Religious organizations used it as proof of divine intervention, and skeptics tried unsuccessfully to debunk it. Jabulani, the security guard who had witnessed it all, became something of a celebrity himself. He was interviewed by journalists from around the world, all wanting to hear his account of that night. But he always gave the same simple answer. I saw what I saw. A man in a coma got up, saved a baby's life, and went back to his coma. Some things don't need explanation. They just need to be accepted. He continued working at the hospital, but now he watched his monitors with different eyes. He had learned that miracles could happen at any moment, in the most unexpected ways. 6 months after his awakening, Chidi returned to the hospital for a checkup. Dr. Babatunde ran every test imaginable, and all showed the same thing: complete recovery. There was no sign of the brain damage that should have resulted from his accident and subsequent coma. Medically speaking, Doctor, Babatunde told him, you shouldn't be walking, talking, or functioning at this level. But here you are, Chidi smiled. Maybe that's the point, Doctor. Maybe we're not meant to understand everything. Maybe some things happen to remind us that there's more to life than what we can measure and analyze. As he left the hospital that day, Chidi stopped by room 306, now occupied by another patient. He stood in the doorway for a moment, remembering those 3 months of darkness and the one moment of clarity that had changed everything. Then he walked down to the pediatric ward, where a healthy, giggling baby, Kesi, was playing with her mother. The child's laughter echoed through the corridors, a sound of pure joy that seemed to heal everyone who heard it. She's going to do great things, Dalila said, watching her daughter play. I can feel it. She was saved for a purpose. We all were, Chidi replied, thinking of his own children waiting at home, of his wife who had never given up hope, of all the families his foundation would help in the years to come. As he left the hospital and stepped into the bright Lagos sunshine, Chidi felt a deep sense of peace. He had died and come back, had existed between worlds, had been an instrument of something greater than himself. The accident on Third Mainland Bridge had taken his whole life, but it had given him something more valuable, an understanding that miracles weren't just possible, they were necessary. They were the threads that held the fabric of humanity together, reminding us that we are more than flesh and blood, more than neurons and synapses. We are souls capable of reaching across the void to save each other. The story of the miracle at Lagos General Hospital continued to be told for years. Medical students studied it, religious leaders preached about it, and families facing impossible situations drew hope from it. But for those who were there, for Jabulani who witnessed it, for Dalila whose child was saved, for Amara who got her husband back, and for Chidi himself, it was more than a story. It was proof that love, faith, and the human spirit could transcend the boundaries of what we think is possible. And in room 306 of Lagos General Hospital, where it all happened, nurses still speak in hushed tones about the night a comatose man rose to save a dying baby. They say if you stand very still in that room, you can sometimes feel it. A presence, a warmth, a reminder that miracles are real, and they can happen to anyone, at any time, in the most unexpected ways. The security cameras still record everything that happens in that hospital, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And Jabulani's replacement, a young man named Taiwo, watches those monitors with special attention, knowing that he might be the next witness to something extraordinary. Because if there's one thing the miracle of room 306 taught everyone at Lagos General Hospital, it's this: the impossible is just waiting for the right moment to become possible. And sometimes all it takes is one person, guided by love and purpose, to bridge the gap between life and death, between despair and hope, between the ordinary and the miraculous.